As folks think about approaching the LSAT, thinking about the LSAT, and maybe going on taking it in a few months, I want folks to keep in mind questions around LSAT accommodations and what they are, having all the information that you might need to best approach that question and to not be afraid of it, and to not, feel confused around if that might be the right fit for you. I am Monique, an associate law school consultant here at Montgomery Admissions Consulting, where we specialize in working with first generation and minority law school applicants. Today, I am so excited and honored to be joined by Jasmeene Burton-Martin, who is actually going to introduce herself, but I would love to hear her perspective on these issues. So, Jasmeene, take it over.
I am a second year law student at Northwestern. I'm originally from Southern California, and I braved the cold to, study education policy, although law school is a broad thing. And I discovered that that was my passion, through working in various government organizations. But really, when I worked with Sydney through the consulting process, it really helped me hone in like that's really what I wanted to do for law school. A little bit about like LSAT, the process. I actually took the very first LSAT Flex, so right when they were starting to come out of the pandemic and do it virtual, and then they kept it virtual, I feel like I've seen this change through the course of the pandemic, which is pretty cool. But I started tutoring actually like in the middle of my studying for the LSAT. I was in study groups, and it ended up becoming this cool thing where, you start like explaining stuff to people, and you're like, wait, it helps me, but it's also like really effective. And it kind of just became something I did as I was waiting for my applications to come back, and then even as a first year. And through that process, like also questions about accommodations. I myself have a couple of disabilities that, I had to go through the accommodations process myself. And I think that, LSAC has a lot more guidance than it did a year ago. They're getting better with being more transparent about what's required. But I've definitely helped a lot of people. I think at this point, like over 40, almost 50 people get accommodations on the LSAT. And it's like something that I'm very passionate about, because I think the more that you can advocate for yourself, we just don't realize things are available, but it really makes a difference. And I think seeing it in school too, this translates into like class accommodations sometimes, or like you'll have to think about how to get accommodations for the bar or the MPRE, which is the multi-state performance something exam about ethics.
That
I
was
don't know yet. I haven't taken it. But these things are, it doesn't really stop with the LSAT, but this is a really great place to start if you are thinking that you might need some extra support, or there's things that you're just like, I can't get over this hurdle and I've studied. There's something else out there that's missing from the equation.
I think a big part of this is not only making sure that folks have access to the information about what is available to them. One thing that I always remember, just like from my own experience, is that resources aren't resources unless they're accessible, right? It's not, I don't consider it a resource if I don't know it exists, right? And if you're not making sure that students know and have access to, and also destigmatizing, I think, as you mentioned, like being able to know that there's nothing wrong with having access to accommodations and having all the information about them is like half of that step of that, oh, this is something that I can actually use and that can benefit me, and there's nothing wrong with that, and here's where to find information on it. So absolutely. And I think, right, sharing our own stories of like there are lots of folks who have various reasons why they might need additional support or different types of supports, and like that's also something that we should all talk about. I think we need to be more aware of the fact that that's normal and that's okay. I want to kind of dive into logistics for folks, because I think there are a lot of students who might know that they have a learning difference, or that they have test anxiety, but they're not exactly sure what kind of accommodations they might be able to access, or that that's an option. And so I would love if we could start by talking about what are the categories of LSAT accommodations, and kind of what goes on in that respect. What can students access that way?
Okay, so and this is, I also should say, like if you're somebody who is just gonna see this information and hear it like, oh no, I'm gonna miss it. This is also on the LSAC website. It's written down, and again, it's like much more filled out and robust than it has been in the past. But there's a lot of different kinds of accommodations that are available, and I think people don't realize, like, we always hear about like extra time or breaks. There's even more, like in terms of the types of breaks. There's breaks between each section if you need it. There's start and stop break. If you're somebody who you might need a print copy of the test, that's something that you can request. And that's not something we always think about. For folks who need, like, if you use a screen reader on a typical basis or you have trouble seeing the size of print, I think that now they've worked on the software to make sure that the online version is actually screen reader accessible and that you can toggle the text size yourself. So you don't need an accommodation for that. But like they've got a lot of different things. Like I've seen, oh goodness, there's sometimes they have people who read it for you if you really like if screen reader doesn't work. And I think I should say like it's a case by case basis. If there's something that they have on the website, like they have a list of possible accommodations, commonly requested accommodations. They also say what you don't need accommodations to bring. Like, for example, if you get really distracted, you can bring earplugs, regardless of whether that's, whether you would normally have an accommodation for that on a different exam or not. You can bring whatever types of writing utensils that you so desire. Before, like some people would have to request like colored pencils, and that's not the case anymore. I've also seen people do like snacks. I'm not sure if that's currently I think you can bring juice boxes without an accommodation, but if you need to eat during the test, like sometimes you just have to ask for that just to make sure that you're allowed to have it. And that's especially if you are pregnant, if you're somebody who is managing diabetes or another condition where you just need to eat on a regular basis. A test is a long test. And if you can't make it during those breaks, it can be really difficult. But there's all sorts of things. I mean, get creative because even if it's not on the website as a commonly requested accommodation, you're trying to think about the needs that you have. And so long as it's reasonable, they should grant it. Like that is your legal right under the ADA. Just saying. But a lot of these requests go into like these categories. The LSAC will require like different documentation, excuse me, based on what you're requesting. So in terms of like the formal categories, we have category 1, category 2, category 3, and they're really based off of extended time and how much you're requesting. So category 1 is your most, simple type of accommodation request, and that's, anything except for extended time. So that would be your print. That would be, those extra stacks. I think start stop breaks might not be in that category. It's changed over the years. But, if you're as long as you're not asking for extended time, that's like, your double time, time and a half, that's your category 1. The second category is for people who are requesting at least 50% extra time or time and a half. And that's, I think category 2 is also people who do not have like the visual impairment, or if you're requesting 100% extra time, so double time, and you have a visual impairment. So they're really kind of basing it off of your natural ability, the things that you're working with in the time. The third category, it's like I think they call it exceptional needs, where more than 50% if you don't have a visual impairment, or it's more than 100% for folks who do. Usually requests will not fall in that category for the vast majority of people. Most people are going to be in that category 1 or category 2 type of thing. Those are the broad overviews, and they're separated out by category based on the types of documentation that you need. And I'll kind of pause there, Monique, if you have like questions,
Yeah.
or if folks
Yeah.
have questions on that, because I know it's confusing.
Yes. And I love
There's a lot of information.
there are so many different layers to it, and I think it can be overwhelming for folks. I love that you pointed out like there are always multiple ways to engage the answers you need, and that's important too. Like I'm the kind of person where it's like I need to write out every single piece of what I'm thinking about or what my needs might be. Some people want to hear things like that spoken. Whatever way you access it, if you're like, actually, I'm going to fast forward through this and then I'm going to go to the LSAC website and be like, oh, I wanted to learn about this and this. You do that. But I think though, another thing that I realized from as you were kind of going through the various accommodation options is that it isn't one size fits all, right? And so it might be that there are little things like you might need a snack. Like you're so right. I have encountered folks who are expecting children and their needs in their testing time look a little bit different than they might under other circumstances. That you should be able to access accommodations for something like that. And so knowing that, like, I think there are students who are like, oh, I don't have certain types of access needs doesn't necessarily mean that it's going to be a one size fits all, and you should still know what's available to you. But I love that overview where you talked about all the. I
And I
really
think it's important. Oh, sorry. Go
no.
ahead.
Hear it. Tell me.
I think, just kind of being on that, it's not one size fits all, but I like people to anchor in what do you need?
Yeah.
Because you'd be surprised. Like it's kind of like this design thinking concept of like, like, how do I fix that need? Like, you'd be surprised. Like, I don't even think they have this on the website, but you can request extra scratch paper. I've had students who've done that. And you think, okay, well, I wouldn't like if you like writing things out, of course that makes so much sense and it's reasonable. And
Yeah.
they do grant it. Like some people need to like pace while they're thinking. And I know typically you have to sit, you have to be in clear view for Proctor
Hmm.
U.
Yeah.
But that's something you can do. You can sit, you can stand. There's all sorts of things. It's really a design thinking type of deal. But just because it's not on the website doesn't mean you can't request it. You just have to be able to back it up with your documentation.
I think that's like a fabulous segue into some of the more logistical. Okay, I realize that I have some needs that an accommodation might be able to support me with during my LSAT prep and making sure that I have what I need. I think now the last piece is execution of the process of requesting accommodations. What are the things that a student needs to keep in mind in terms of what they'll need to provide to the Law School Admissions Council as they request their accommodations, and how do they compile that documentation? So we can start with the first one, if that's okay.
Yeah. So, and I will also say this is a lot of information. So it's on the LSAC website. I think it's under documentation requirements, like it's something like that page. But this is going to go back to the different categories that we talked about, category 1, 2, and 3, which all depend on, are you getting extended time? If so, how much? So that first category of requests where it's no extended time whatsoever, there's going to be like, you're going to have to provide some kind of documentation, just so that way they know what's going on. And usually that's very straightforward because you're like, okay, well, I have this need. Usually it's some kind of, like I know folks who, like I'm like 8 months pregnant. I'm going to need to get up and use the restroom and like I'm going to need snacks on a regular basis. So that's going to be really straightforward. It probably doesn't have to be something as, robust as a request for extended time or breaks. That one, you're probably going to have to give them, a diagnosis. Like I know ADHD is a common one. I've seen folks with dyscalculia or, other neurovisual like learning impairments, but there's also other reasons too. You might have broken your arm and you kind of need some help getting that in there, but you're just going to have to provide that documentation. You're going to have to do a little bit more of a lift. It's also going to depend on, have you gotten accommodations on other exams or in schools and things like that. So there's a couple of ways that LSAC will look at your documentation, and this is going to kind of determine, how much deference they give you, and also contributes to how much you have to work for it. So if you have had LSAT accommodations before, like they're just going to give it to you probably. For the most part, like people are not spanning more than 5 years. So if you've had it in this like interim period, don't even worry about it. If you've taken an earlier test that wasn't necessarily online, you may want to think about how do those old accommodations translate into your new ones on this LSAT like flex type. Is it still the LSAT flex or is it just the LSAT? Like the virtual test. Think about how those might differ, what might translate over. But if you already had them, you have them. That second level of deference is that they're going to look at other standardized tests. So if you in high school had accommodations on the SAT, the ACT, or one of those like entrance exams like the IC or things like that, they're going to look at that and say, okay, well, somebody else approved this. The GRE too, I forgot. That's a common one. GMAT, all those professional school things too. If you had it on one of those, they're going to look at that and say, okay, well, we don't really have to vet this as hard. You can provide that documentation that you had it on another test, although you probably have documentation of disability already. I would just put it in there, make them work for it. They're asking for all these papers. That third category where most people that I see come in is like that other request. So you probably have like not had accommodations at all before, or you had them in college, but not on a standardized test. And that was definitely me. Like I came in, I had accommodations for anxiety my last year of college. And I was like, I don't know what I can get on the LSAT. So then they go into the categories. So you're going to have to provide documentation of, if you had it in college, great. But if you didn't, that's not the end of the end of the road for you. You're just going to really have to do a great job of demonstrating like what are the needs that you have, and that it's not enough to just say like, oh, you have a disability. So if you don't actually have a documented disability, you're okay. You want to get into like, how does this show up for you on, when you're practicing? in your daily life, when you're in a test situation? Like, what are the challenges that you're going through? There's a lot of people, especially from our minority communities and our first-gen communities, who it's like, oh, I think I'm experiencing anxiety, and we're just kind of used to it. It's normal. You best believe there are people who have the language, who've had family members who, like, they're used to this. They're like, this is not normal, and they request it really easily. So if you're somebody who's like, I don't know, like, it seems like a normal thing, but I'm always stressed. I'm always like having distraction as I'm like trying to, do things that are high pressure. Like, those are good indications that you might want to, I mean, one, I always am like a proponent of therapy if you can get into a therapist's office, but also thinking about like, okay, this is distracting you from what you're doing on this exam. If you're not requesting extended time, for breaks, like, you're still going to say like, okay, here's what my doctor or my mental health professional is like asking me or like recommending that I do. But here's how it fills in my needs. And you're going to like submit that candidate form, which you can do through the LSAC portal, or you can have the paper copy. And what that is giving your biographical information. So your name, your LSAC ID number, what you're trying to request. And then there's also going to be this qualified professional form, which is basically, the way of saying, who's co-signing this? Who is saying, okay, yeah, so-and-so is going through these challenges with this disability, or like, maybe it's a generalized thing and we can't really place it, but they definitely need something. And so that's going to be your doctor, your mental health professional, your specialist, and they're just going to fill it out as well. The candidate form has very similar boxes to the qualified professional form, and so it's often helpful for you to fill out that candidate form and bring it to your appointment if you like haven't. Well, even if you have a documented disability, bringing it into your mental health or medical health provider can see, okay, what are you requesting and why, and talk about it. I think sometimes people feel really anxious if they don't have a documented disability, or even if you do and you just haven't had the conversation about how to get accommodations on an exam or in school. Having that just to anchor the conversation can reduce a lot of stress, but then also help you get more ideas on, what has that doctor seen? Doctors also like, they can be creative too. It's kind of their job to look at a situation and triage. They can do the same thing here. So have that conversation. You can be very candid. Part of the candidate form too, and that also kind of helps the process, is you just write out, how does this show up for me? And I have people think, and I'm going to say it a ton of times, think about the needs that you have. What are the difficulties? And then what can actually help you get through those? And sometimes when you're studying too, test some things out. So like, is it extra scratch paper? Does it help you to actually write things out and have not just the 5 sheets back to front and back, but maybe you need 10 sheets, and you don't have to get really specific on the number. I don't think, like, I think you can just like throw it out there. But does that help you to write it down so you can feel like the tactile elements, or does it help to read out loud? And as you kind of play with things in your studying, you can like say, I've studied using these tactics and it really helps because, like a good example, I have a lot of anxiety. And so I'm like, okay, I have racing thoughts. It's really distracting. I also have ADHD. And so I'm like, when I get anxious, I'm sitting here looking at all of these thoughts and I can't focus, and then I'm not focused and ADHD kind of goes off and I go and, spiral, and then it creates more anxiety. It's like that cycle, right? I can describe that and say, well, what's going to help me overcome that? Well, for me, like I'm a big fidgeter, and I didn't know I had ADHD when I took the test. In retrospect, I would have done this, but I would have said, like, I really need to like pace around in things. That's going to really help me, because then I'm not like, I can deal with the racing thoughts and use that to anchor. And that's going to help me reduce my anxiety so I can get back to this test. That also might mean I need to request start-stop breaks so I can pace around. And so just think about how you're going to target those needs that you have, and then do a really good job of explaining, like, me being able to pace around addresses this issue, and that's why I should have it. It's going to seem really tedious, but you're just going to go like, this is what I have that's really giving me difficulty. Here's what would help, and this is what I'm requesting. It's like a nice little formula. That's like the candidate form statement of need. Like, you're just going to go, and it doesn't have to be long, but I also want you to make sure that you're doing a thorough job. Like, do enough to where you've like made your case, but also like err on the side of too long, because honestly, let's make it work for it. As long as you are very clear at the beginning, here's what I'm requesting. Okay, so that's like category 1. You're just going to have that like candidate form, qualified professional form, stuff that you fill out, that your doctor or your mental health professional will fill out. There's a lot of overlap, but I'd say fill out the candidate form, take it to your professional. Category 2 and category 3, they're going to have the same, the same exact forms. But when you're doing a category 2 request, because like they're really skeptical to give people that extra time, whether you have a visual impairment or not, like that's kind of like the standard that they're going to give you is like that 50% or the 100% if you have that visual impairment. They want to see everything. They don't just give those out. And so if you had accommodations in school, even if like I've seen cases where people had it for a couple years and then decided for various reasons they didn't want it. That's a really common story because, we often feel marginalized. We like people can tell you have an accommodation and so you just didn't want to deal with it. That's okay because you had them. So just explain, just say like, well, at some point in 8th grade, I stopped because like I had to go to a separate room and I didn't want to do that. Like it might sound weird to you, but it's truthful. You're just trying to address all the questions that might come up because they might say like, okay, well, why did you quit it? Like clearly you don't need it. No, like just explain like for various reasons. And it might feel like it's not legitimate, but it is. You're just telling the story of like how this showed up for you. And that could be like if you had formal accommodations or not. So in high school, like I know I had a professor they're teachers in high school. I had a teacher who would let me do my exams verbally because I would get really stressed trying to write things out. And it would take me a long time to write out my exams. I mean, he would let me come in during lunches and just like finish the exam because it was all writing based. But like that's something that I wrote in my own accommodation because it was like, I would get really stressed trying to do everything under time pressure. But my professor really valued seeing my thoughts. And so I could come in during a lunch period and finish it up. Or I could give my exam in chemistry orally because I was better at explaining it and would get really stressed about using the terminology. So even if you've had like teachers who've just, done things to help you, whether in a learning context, in a test like context, add that information. If you had other things that like you might be working with friends, like you might be in a professional space and like there's things that like informally have helped you just with daily life, talk about it. Give them every single, way that these things show up because it's not just when you're studying. It's not just on test day. It can show up other places and it's going to help make your case more robust. Now, if you haven't had formal or informal accommodations, you're really going to hone in on like that piece of like, how does this show up for me during the day? How does this show up for me when I'm practicing and on the exam? So for example, like I know, like granted, I got diagnosed after I took the exams. I was so mad. Like, I'm like, how did I know I had ADHD? This would have been totally different. But like during the day, I'm like, I get really like I'm best in the morning if I'm not taking my medications. But as soon as it gets to like 2 o'clock, oh, I'm done. I'm extra distracted. So like, how do I overcome that? Like, part of it is like my test. Like, whenever I do work in the morning. I just kind of assume that it's going to be whatever it is. In the later afternoon, evening, like I just kind of give up. And I'm like, okay, I only feel motivated to like clean my room and do like tactile things. But you can talk about the fact that it's like, well, I know that like I'm going to be so distracted that I will just get anxious trying to do my like rereading, writing. And this is like totally the case in school. So I was like, well, thankfully I have medication that helps me manage it. And so I talk about that. But even then, like my medication putters out around 5 or 6 in the afternoon. So then what do? I change the way I live to accommodate that. And that's something that you can discuss really candidly in those statements to say like, okay, well, it may not be directly pertinent, but here's why I need this accommodation. Like I need to be able to like show like there are things that will help me reduce the anxiety. There are things that are going to help me focus because like this is clearly an issue and here's how it shows up in my daily life. And I will say too, some people don't feel comfortable sharing all that information. You only want to talk about what's in like the testing situation or the practice situation. And that's totally fine not to go with your personal life. At the very least, talk about how this shows up in your practice and when you've done timed practice, or if you've taken the LSAT before without accommodations, talk about that because that is super crucial. They want to see like, okay, is this actually an issue or is this a manufactured issue? I don't like they police it like that, but unfortunately that's how it is when people don't have disabilities and are running, things. So that's kind of how you go about it. Category 3, most people don't fall into that, but like same type of deal. And I think category 3 requests are usually only granted, the folks who have a documented disability, it's longstanding. You probably know who you are because it's just the really uncommon things, and those actually are kind of easier because you have to have those documented. Now, if you do not, and you're like, okay, well, I've got some serious things, and whether it's because of like insurance not being available to you or other things, like still put in those requests. You're almost like, I mean, everyone, as long as you have those professionals in place, it's possible to get those. You're just going to really have to make that case. So if you think about the categories as like, levels of like, you have to put the time in to really like explicitly state why and really justify it. Like you can think about that, like category one, you justify it enough, but they're not going to have that much scrutiny because of the extra time component. As you get more time, they're going to want more explanation and more documentation, ideally. I know that was very long-winded. Very long-winded.
I love every single second of it, actually. And I think one of the things that it brings out, and I'm so thankful, Jasmeene, for your like insight and just like not only your own experience bringing in, because I think that helps folks, is like someone who is doing what I want to be doing can openly talk about their experience with this. Like that's incredibly empowering, and we don't see that as much as we would like to, right? Like that representation of like, oh, like having different needs is okay, and you can still go to law school, and you can still be an attorney, and you can still get accommodations, and I think that's really meaningful. On top of the fact that I think you opened up the layered, not just the layers of the levels of accommodations, but the layers of these processes in ways I just want to validate for everyone, like it just in echo of you, of like, there are questions of insurance, there are questions of, social stigma within various communities, and that's all linked to this very like this process. It's like, do you need accommodations or want to like, do you have access needs in addition to all of this kind of living under the surface? And so to validate for folks, like if this feels very tricky and very like, right, there are so many layers I have to go through, like validating that that's real, because it's not just, right, like everything that you said, I think the long-windedness of it fits, like how much folks are sort of having to explore to get to, I'm having trouble with this, I don't feel like all my needs are met, maybe I need accommodations. There's a lot going on in the middle as well. And as someone, I also I very significant documented anxiety. I have always been very connected and some chronic issues, very connected to medical professionals, and that's something like that's, I don't know, that's a level of privilege, but that's also something that I more confidently maybe than many can navigate medical spaces, but they can often be barriered in and of themselves, right? Like if I were to call a medical professional right now and say I'd like an appointment, they might say maybe in a year. So not always, but right, like they're like, especially if a student's like, well, I want to take the LSAT in November and it's it's May, and they reach out to providers, and so there are a lot of barriers, and I want to validate them.
Right.
I don't want folks to feel like, oh, that maybe why does it feel so hard for me when it like
Yeah.
no, but I think reaching out to those resources, like folks who are excited to talk about it, who want to help. I love helping folks navigate, like, oh yeah, like here's how we get from point A to point B, here's how we work through this process. And so reach out to your resources. If you're at an institution, if you're at a school, there are people there who are paid to help with that and who are very excited to help you navigate that process and finding the right ones for you and all of that. So in addition to kind of getting the documentation, I really love that you brought in sort of the many layers that go into that. I think finding supports is one of the ways to kind of tackle that barrier.
And I want to speak to folks who like, especially like I've worked with one or two people who like didn't have insurance. Unfortunately, like that qualified professional form is just like the form of gatekeeping. And I think as best as you can do to like also gather, like you can talk to like teachers that you've had, you can talk to professors, and that's not going to be sufficient, but tell it in your statement of need, like explain like any anxiety that you have of like this process feels so inaccessible, tell them about that. Like LSAC, has many problems. I have problems with standardized tests and things. There are a lot of gatekeeping that happens, but they do acknowledge that like not everyone's coming from the same place. And so, you can talk about the fact that you didn't have insurance. You can talk about, like let's say you had issues with the VA and, getting your benefits, there was a lapse in, continuity of care. You can talk about that. I think for folks who don't currently have that access to insurance, or maybe you do, but it's still prohibitively expensive to go see someone because it's for a specialist or things like that, do like think about who can speak to the needs that you have, and then like go from there. There's always a chance. But also too, like you can go to like there's various resources in terms of like community clinics and people who like you can show up with all this documentation. It's like, hi, like I really need somebody to fill out this form. But here's all like the people who can speak to this, and you're kind of like the person that can help seal the deal. Also provide all those things to LSAC. Just drown them in papers for making you go through this, to be honest. But yeah, like I've seen people who've also they've gone through like BetterHelp or other like virtual systems where, you know, they didn't continue using the service, but they said like, hi, here's what I need. Here's like all this, like, here's everything that I have. Please help. There's also like clinics that like will meet, like I know, especially with like COVID, there's a lot of virtual clinics who like, they don't necessarily take insurance, but like it might be like $30 to $50 and they just see you and like can give you documentation there. Like I know with COVID, like I was like, I need somebody to like attest the fact that I have COVID because I was like, I can't go in and see my doctor. They've got like a 3-4 like month waiting list and I'm very immunocompromised. So I was like, I need this antiviral like today. And so like that's a quick way to do that too. Like there are ways to get around it. And unfortunately, like it's like you have to do it like with time or like some form of money, but there are cheap ways to do it efficiently as well. But, you know, I'm very much a fan of, you know, if you know that you need support, I highly recommend getting to build that relationship with a provider if possible. And sometimes like it's worth taking the time, but you know, talk to somebody who's like, you know, trying to get you straight with like the application process and like the medical process. Cause sometimes it's not like pertinent or not pertinent. It's just not reasonable to hold up your law school dreams and career based off of like, you know, getting into like the medical space to have this done. Like I really dislike that it really puts up barriers for people and I feel that really hard, but do the best you can. Like there are so many ways that demonstrate need. I guess the last thing, like to sum up, like you have the candidate form, you have the qualified professional form. If there's things that you can think of that help make your case, also put those in there. Tell the story, tell it from different like perspectives. Cause like that you're just really explaining like, here's how this shows up for me and here's how I got here. And if there's any questions that like feel like, okay, well, they're going to deny me because of this, just explain candidly. Like that's actually really simple. And I think Sydney like will also say the same things like throughout the writing process of your statements. Like in your personal statements, like, okay, is there a question that they might have that, you know, why did I do this? Like, why did I do this? You explain it, right? Or like when we talk about addendums, that's like the most translatable place. It's like, well, I'm afraid that they're going to have questions about this. You just state why it happened the way it did.
Yeah.
That's all it is. And like, that's so applicable here. So I could go on like forever about that, but just
love
like
it.
tell it candidly.
Speak your truth also in that space, and I think especially the idea that you shared, like it can like give them all the information and also start with this is why I need this, and so starting with that like concrete and then going into here are all the things that you might be wondering. It sounds like a really meaningful way to go about it so that they
there's a lot of reasons that people might not have exactly. Like I've worked with people who's like, I saw a therapist 5 years ago, but it's more than 5 years old. And it's like, well, why? Like they just didn't have insurance or they were like out of the country. Like there's all sorts of reasons. Or like I had someone who like their therapist died and like they couldn't find the documentation at that clinic. Like there's reasons. If you feel like it's like, oh no, I must be the only one. Well, it's a very exceptional case. Like talk about it.
Yeah.
Talk about how you're managing that in the interim. Just like, I feel like someone else like has a soul, you know, but there's good reasons. There are good reasons that you're in this position that you're in, and you can talk about those candidly.
Yeah, absolutely. And I do think that the way that you related it back to the admissions process of like this unseen individual community organization is now going to have all of that insight. I want to say one thing, because sometimes students will ask this and I think it ties in, is that as a law school admissions officer, not that one, I would not have any concern, but that's not something that's ever going to be shared with a law school admissions office, right? That is from your pen to LSAC, and that's it. And that's all. That's really the people who need to know. You are absolutely right. Like based on how you want to sort of tell your story, what you share and don't share is entirely up to you. But that is no one's concern or business other than you getting the supports that you need in that moment. And so sometimes students are worried, like, well, law schools, no, that's just to answer that common question. It's no, and it's none of their concern. And then another piece that Jasmeene brought up, I think, is also that candid truth of like these unseen people are also still people. I've called LSAC just like questions for students and things, and right? I do get met with a human, and they're like, yeah, like just tell me that, and I'm like, okay, cool. That's what we're gonna do. And it's if that helps. Sometimes you might have a question. You can also call the LSAT candidate support line and be like, this is what's going on. What should I do? And the answer that I have generally got, just tell us. So that can be helpful as well. Of like what in this scenario. Generally, I think that advice holds true. But there are humans over there, just like there are in the admissions office and in all those other settings who are out there part of these processes as well. So I know we've had a long chat, but I think it's been an important, a really meaningful one. This is what happens when two people who like to go on are like, let's
Oh
talk.
yeah, I have a lot of like hot takes. I feel like I've gotten a little more unhinged.
No, here we
Go
are. It's not a hot take. I don't know if I want it. No, but here I have been just like so thankful to have this conversation with you. I think more conversations like this just need to continue to happen. People need to know things, and it can sometimes feel like nerve-wracking to even think about, right? Like I don't know how to get the support I need, so I'm just going to keep going this way. And so reminding folks, you have supports out there. There are structures set up in place for you, and telling your story and making sure that you have the supports you need when you can is really important, because we want you to get to your goal. And thank you, Jasmeene, so much again for joining. It was such a pleasure, and we will see you all next week.